On Monday morning, oil traders around the world woke up to a number that a month ago would have been unthinkable. Brent crude fell below $98 a barrel. WTI crude futures tumbled nearly 6% to below $91 a barrel, as optimism grew that the U.S. and Iran could soon reach an agreement to end the conflict and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Brent crude fell roughly 5% toward $98, extending last week's sharp decline. To understand why that number matters, you need to remember where we were just weeks ago. North Sea Dated plunged from a high of $144 a barrel to below $100 before rebounding again. That is not a correction. That is a 32% collapse in the price of the most important commodity on Earth. And it happened because traders believe a deal between the United States and Iran is close. But here's what the market hasn't priced in. The deal isn't signed. It might not get signed. And both sides are saying fundamentally different things about what's in it. Let me walk you through exactly what's happening, because the gap between what the oil market believes and what is actually unfolding in these negotiations is the most dangerous disconnect in global finance right now. On Saturday, May 24th, Trump said in a social media post, "An agreement has been largely negotiated, subject to finalization, between the United States of America, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the various other countries. Details of the agreement were being discussed and will be announced shortly," he said, "including reopening the vital Strait of Hormuz." That sounds definitive. That sounds like a deal is done. Oil traders heard those words and sold, hard. And then within hours, the other side started talking. Iran's Fars news agency reported the Strait of Hormuz would remain under Iran's management, according to the latest exchanged text between Iran and the U.S. The report dismissed Trump's announcement as incomplete and inconsistent with reality. Read that again. The President of the United States says the deal includes reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's state media says the strait stays under Iranian control. Those are not different interpretations of the same deal. Those are two entirely different deals. And it gets worse. Trump failed to mention any agreement on Iran's nuclear program or its highly enriched uranium, both of which his administration has repeatedly cited as critical to ending the war. Iran has sought to put off nuclear talks until after a formal cessation in hostilities. Even as the U.S. and Iran have signaled progress in efforts to end the conflict, Tehran's nuclear program remains out of the discussions at this stage, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said on Monday. So the single most important demand that the Trump administration has made since this war began, that Iran surrender its enriched uranium and dismantle its nuclear sites, is not part of this deal. Not delayed, not deferred to later. According to Iran, not even on the table right now. According to the Financial Times, one of the biggest sticking points for the United States has been its insistence on Iran giving up its 440-kilogram stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Trump is also reportedly demanding Iran dismantle its main three nuclear sites, Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. Reuters reported that Iran's supreme leader had directed that the country's near-weapons-grade uranium should not be sent abroad, hardening Tehran's stance on one of Washington's key demands in the negotiations. So let me lay this out precisely. Trump wants Iran to give up 440 kilograms of enriched uranium. Iran's supreme leader has ordered that the uranium stays in Iran. Trump wants the Strait of Hormuz fully reopened with no Iranian control. Iran says the strait remains under Iranian management. Trump says the deal is largely negotiated. Iran says no one can claim that signing is imminent. And oil just crashed 5%. Because markets think this is almost over. Now I want to take you inside the structure of what's being discussed, because the architecture of this proposed agreement tells you everything about why it might collapse. The agreement includes a memorandum of understanding as a first phase, Iran's foreign ministry said, before broader talks within 30 to 60 days. The deal would include an official declaration of the war's end, with 2-month negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. This is not a peace deal. This is a memorandum of understanding, a framework to begin talking about a deal. And then after the framework is signed, if it gets signed, there would be 30 to 60 days of additional negotiations on the nuclear question, which is the core issue. A CNN analyst put it plainly. We have very general terms about Iran's nuclear commitments. The details would have to be negotiated later, and those details may never be finalized. Just like the Gaza ceasefire agreement that never went to phase 2. That comparison should worry you. The Gaza ceasefire was announced with enormous fanfare. Phase 1 happened. Phase 2 never materialized. The war continued. And the pattern Trump himself has established with Iran follows exactly this trajectory. Since originally saying the war launched by the U.S. and Israel on February 28th would be over in a matter of days, Trump has repeatedly announced the conflict is nearing an end, amid a fragile ceasefire, only for talks to fall through. Now consider the scale of what this war has already done to the global energy system, because even if a deal gets signed tomorrow morning, the damage doesn't reverse tomorrow afternoon. The conflict has caused the restriction of nearly all traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, leading to what the International Energy Agency has characterized as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The head of the IEA described the situation caused by the war as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Those are not my words. Those are the words of the organization that 32 nations created specifically to monitor and respond to oil crises. And when that organization uses phrases like largest and greatest in history, you should understand they're comparing this to 1973. They're comparing this to the Arab oil embargo that reshaped the entire Western economic order. And they're saying this is worse. Cumulative supply losses from Gulf producers already exceed 1 billion barrels, with more than 14 million barrels per day of oil now shut in, an unprecedented supply shock. Vitol CEO Russell Hardy said on April 21st that 1 billion barrels of oil production would be lost because of the war. 1 billion barrels. To put that in a number you can feel, the entire United States consumes roughly 20 million barrels a day. 1 billion barrels represents 50 days of total American oil consumption simply gone from the global market. And the physical infrastructure required to move that oil hasn't been sitting idle, waiting for a peace deal. Gulf oil exports across all routes plunged by 15.8 million barrels per day to just 8.7 million barrels per day in March. Exports transiting the strait averaged 2.3 million barrels per day, just 10% of pre-war levels. 10%. Where 20 million barrels a day once flowed, now barely 2 million trickle through. And those barrels that do move are moving under extraordinary conditions. Iran set up its own shipping channel, north of Larak Island, rather than the main channel south of the island. One ship paid $2 million to use Iran's channel. According to Lloyd's List, payments were being assessed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Chinese yuan. $2 million per ship, paid in yuan, to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. That is the reality of global maritime commerce in 2026. And that reality doesn't disappear when someone signs a memorandum of understanding. Now here's what the oil market is betting on, and here's why that bet is dangerous. Crude prices have reversed aggressively after weeks of gains driven by geopolitical tension. The latest move lower reflects a shift in sentiment, as traders begin to price in a potential resolution. Traders are pricing in hope. They're pricing in Trump's social media posts. They're pricing in the word largely from the phrase largely negotiated. But they're not pricing in the contradictions. They're not pricing in Iran's supreme leader ordering uranium to stay on Iranian soil. They're not pricing in Far's news agency calling Trump's statements inconsistent with reality. And they're definitely not pricing in what happens if this framework collapses the way every previous announcement has collapsed. Because Trump himself has told you what the alternative is. The chance of reaching an agreement, he told Axios, was a solid 50-50. Either he would accept a good deal or blow them to kingdom come. Trump threatened to resume strikes against Iran if the country does not come to an agreement with the U.S. We're going to have a situation where no country will ever be hit as hard as they're about to be hit. 50-50. Those are the president's own odds. And if the coin lands the wrong way, the man who said the deal was largely negotiated also said he would destroy the country he's negotiating with. And then there's the timing problem. Because while the diplomats talk and the traders trade, the physical crisis keeps compounding. 32 member nations of the International Energy Agency unanimously agreed to President Trump's request to lower energy prices with a coordinated release of 400 million barrels of oil and refined products from their respective reserves. As part of this effort, President Trump authorized the Department of Energy to release 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This will take approximately 120 days to deliver based on planned discharge rates. 400 million barrels sounds massive, and it is. It's the largest coordinated emergency release in the history of the IEA. But here's the math that matters. The U.S. alone uses 20 million barrels of oil a day, so the entire current stockpile represents just a 20-day supply. GasBuddy analyst Patrick DeHaan said that $5 diesel was becoming more likely and that $4 per gallon gasoline was gaining steam. Noting the SPR release highlighted the extent of the situation. Yet finite releases still don't replace the Strait of Hormuz. That's the sentence that should be on every front page. Finite releases don't replace the Strait of Hormuz. You can empty every emergency stockpile on the planet, and you still haven't reopened the waterway that carries 20% of global oil trade. The SPR is a painkiller, the Strait is the surgery, and the surgery hasn't been scheduled yet. Despite today's pullback, oil prices remain nearly 50% above pre-war levels. In the United States, nearly 10 million barrels were withdrawn from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve last week, marking the largest release on record. The largest single-week withdrawal ever from the SPR. That's not a government managing a crisis with confidence. That's a government burning through its emergency reserves at a pace that cannot be sustained. Currently, the SPR amounts to just under 400 million barrels. Before the 2022 Ukraine crisis, it held over 600 million. Biden drew it down. Trump is drawing it down further. Unlike previous emergency releases, the 2026 action was structured as an exchange rather than a permanent sale. This structure reflects an attempt by government authorities to strike a balance between meeting immediate demands for price relief while maintaining long-term energy security. At present, the SPR contains slightly more than 415 million barrels of oil, or approximately 40% less than total capacity. 40% below full capacity, and draining. The buffer between you and a genuine energy emergency is thinner than it's been in decades. And here's the part that almost nobody is discussing. Even if a deal gets signed this week, the Strait doesn't reopen overnight. While demand may swing back to growth towards the end of the year if a deal to end the war is agreed that allows flows through the Strait of Hormuz to gradually resume from the third quarter of 2026, supply will likely be slower to recover. As a result, the oil market remains in deficit until the final quarter of the year. With global oil inventories already drawing at a record clip, further price volatility appears likely ahead of the peak summer demand period. The IEA is telling you in their May 2026 oil market report that even in the best-case scenario, the one where a deal actually gets signed and the Strait actually reopens, the global oil market stays in deficit until the fourth quarter of the year. That's October. November. That means 4 more months of drawing down inventories, 4 more months of supply shortages, 4 more months of elevated prices, in the best case. The conflict has set off what Gulf states called the worst global energy crisis in decades, with higher energy prices in the U.S. feeding rising inflation and expectations that the Federal Reserve may need to increase interest rates. Let that land. The Federal Reserve may need to raise rates. Not cut them, raise them. Because energy inflation is feeding into everything, food, transportation, manufacturing, services, and the Fed's tools for fighting inflation don't include reopening a strait or signing a peace deal. Over 30% of global urea, which is widely used and produced from natural gas, is exported from Gulf countries through the strait. Much of the cost of producing some foods, including corn and wheat, is in the cost of fertilizer, and this cost, along with rising energy costs, makes basic food production very expensive. It's not just fuel, it's fertilizer, it's food. The Strait of Hormuz doesn't just carry oil, it carries the raw materials that grow the food you eat. And those supply chains don't snap back when a memorandum of understanding gets signed. They snap back when ships actually move, when insurance companies actually insure, when ports actually accept cargo. That takes months after the political agreement. On March 18th, Iran hit Qatar's Ras Laffan Industrial City (LNG) complex, causing a 17% reduction in Qatar's LNG production capacity. The damages from this attack were estimated to require 3 to 5 years to fully repair. Consequently, LNG spot prices in Asia increased by over 140%. 3 to 5 years. Qatar's LNG infrastructure, some of the most advanced energy infrastructure on the planet, damaged in a single strike, requiring half a decade to rebuild. That damage is done. No deal erases it. Damage to energy facilities in Middle Eastern countries could cost $25 billion to repair. $25 billion in physical infrastructure damage across the Gulf region. Pipelines, refineries, loading terminals, LNG plants. This is not a light switch you turn back on. Now let me bring this to where you actually live, because the 5% oil crash on Monday morning isn't going to show up at your gas station for weeks. Oil markets move in real time. Gas stations reprice on what they already paid for the fuel in their underground tanks. And the cascade between crude prices and consumer prices has a lag that most people don't understand. War risk insurance policies held by the owners of ships sailing in the region reportedly have a 72-hour cancellation clause at the discretion of the insurance providers when a conflict ensues. This allows insurers to recalibrate the risk, and they reportedly have in this case, resulting in premiums that are 4 or 5 times greater than they were previously. Shipping insurance has quadrupled or quintupled. Those costs don't reverse the day a framework agreement gets announced. Insurance companies wait. They watch. They verify that ships are actually moving safely before they lower premiums. And until premiums come down, shipping costs stay elevated, which means the cost of every product that moves by sea stays elevated, which means the price you pay for everything from gasoline to groceries stays elevated. U.S. President Donald Trump claimed that the naval blockade is costing Iran $500 million daily, while the U.S. Department of Defense estimated Iran lost $4.8 billion in oil revenue by May 1st. With Iran's tankers hunted by the U.S. Navy, oil and condensate loadings at its ports collapsed from 2.1 million barrels per day before the blockade to just 567,000 barrels per day after. Iran is losing $500 million a day. Its export capacity has collapsed by 73%, and yet it has not agreed to a single one of Washington's core demands. Not the uranium, not the nuclear sites, not unconditional reopening of the strait. That should tell you something about how much pain Iran is willing to absorb, and it should tell you something about how confident anyone should be that this deal will actually close. Iran's top negotiator told a Pakistani counterpart that Iran wouldn't compromise its legitimate rights and expressed distrust of the U.S. Iran's armed forces have rebuilt capabilities damaged since the start of the conflict in late February, Iran's parliament speaker said. Iran is rebuilding its military while negotiating a peace deal. Think about what that signals. It signals a country that is preparing for both outcomes simultaneously. And if it's preparing for both, you should be too. A person familiar with the matter told NPR that Israel is very unhappy with the emerging deal and views it as an economic deal that doesn't address Israel's security concerns. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas said the president should stick to his red lines, adding it would be a disastrous mistake if an agreement resulted in Iran being able to develop nuclear weapons and have control over the Strait of Hormuz. So Israel is unhappy. Republican senators are warning against it. Iran says the nuclear issue isn't part of it. Iran's state media says the strait stays under Iranian control, and the oil market just priced in a resolution. A regional official with direct knowledge of the Pakistan-led mediation efforts cautioned that last-minute disputes could blow up the efforts. This is not the first time in recent weeks that a deal has been described as close. Trump has repeatedly set deadlines for Tehran and then backed off. That is perhaps the most important sentence in this entire analysis. Trump has repeatedly set deadlines for Tehran and then backed off. He threatened to destroy Iranian civilization. He didn't. He launched Operation Project Freedom to escort ships through the strait. He paused it 2 days later because of great progress toward a possible agreement. He announced the war would be over in days. On March 9th, Trump said that the war is very complete, pretty much. It's now May 25th, and the war is not complete at all. So here is where we actually stand. Oil is at $98. Traders are celebrating, and the fundamentals say this: the deal is a framework for future talks. The nuclear issue is unresolved. The strait remains blocked. The SPR is draining at record pace. Physical infrastructure damage will take years to repair. Insurance costs remain at crisis levels. And even in the IEA's optimistic scenario, the global oil market stays in deficit until October. The price crash you saw this morning was not the market telling you the crisis is over. It was the market telling you what it hopes. And hope, in commodity markets, has a very short shelf life. Because the moment one statement from Tehran contradicts one statement from Washington, every barrel sold on optimism this week gets repriced on reality next week. And reality, right now, is a strait that hasn't reopened, a deal that hasn't been signed, and two countries that can't agree on what they're even negotiating. So when you see the price at your pump and wonder whether it's about to come down, ask yourself one question: is the Strait of Hormuz open? And if the answer is no, then neither is this crisis.